Hello there and good afternoon and welcome to our Ukraine Q&A with Professor Michael Clarke. Professor Clarke, here as always. Thank you very much for joining us. How are you today, Michael?
Yeah, I'm doing very well, thank you.
Good. We've got questions that have come in from you guys, as always. We do appreciate you sending them in. And remember, if you want to send in questions as we're going along, you can do it on our website through the Ukraine blog, or you can put them in the comments on the live YouTube feed. Let's crack on. The diplomacy today, Michael, is over in Berlin, where President Volodymyr Zelensky is meeting with the new Chancellor Friedrich Merz. Yep. There has been talk for the past few days about a German missile perhaps going to the Ukrainians finally. So this first question is from Jess236, and it's about the Taurus or Taurus missile. Mm-hmm. How do you interpret the confusion around Merz's announcement on missiles this week? And would Taurus missiles be decisive in escalation, particularly to nuclear? Is it Taurus or Taurus? Do we know?
Taurus, generally, but
okay,
I mean, but either will do.
I've heard it
I don't think Merz is particularly uncertain about this. I mean, he said we're going to preserve strategic ambiguity exactly the way the French do. Mm-hmm. So we're not announcing normally, exactly what we're giving to the Ukrainians. We're giving to the Ukrainians what we think we can and that they want. And, the Russians will find out about it when these weapons are used in some way, but there's no need to advertise it. That's what he's saying. On the other hand, there might be a political reason to talk about the Taurus missile now, because everyone's been waiting to say, look, Chancellor Scholz said we will not give these missiles. We absolutely won't, because they could go too far, they could do too much damage, they might be provocative. And there's a lot of criticism of that. And Merz said before he became Chancellor, we ought to give them Taurus missiles. So the assumption is he might now make an announcement about it. But as a matter of policy, he's now saying that we won't say this in advance. We'll give equipment as we think we should, and the Ukrainians will use it in the way that they want.
Yeah, and that meeting between the two men is ongoing. There's probably going to be something of a news conference later. We may get an announcement on it, or again, this ambiguity will remain because he's essentially said that we're going to supply these and that you can use them to hit longer range targets.
Yeah, he's saying there are no longer. This is what he said very clearly yesterday, the night before. He said there are no longer any range restrictions on the missiles that Ukraine can use that they've acquired from the West, and that is the case for the British, the French, we the Germans, and the United States. And that's the big one, the US, because all those restrictions, that caution was originally coming from the Biden administration, who said, look, we'll give you these weapons, but you can only use them at certain ranges, you can only use them in the Kursk area, you can only use them immediately across the border. There is a sense now in which, the gloves have come off a little bit more as far as Western support goes, and they've said, we are confident that the Ukrainians will not be using these weapons against civilian targets. Mm-hmm. If they did, they'd lose our support pretty quickly. They will only be used against military targets, and we're happy about that because Ukrainians are the best ones to select which targets will make the biggest difference to them on the battlefield. If they can hit the rear areas, if they can hit storage sites and ammunition dumps and fuel storage and so on, that's what makes a difference on the front line.
Yeah, and interesting that after you said that a couple of days ago, we haven't had the Trump administration coming out and saying that, no, you can't use these long-range missions, because that was eventually the permission that was given by President Biden, and obviously hasn't been rescinded by Trump.
No, that's right. And so now in a sense, the range, according to Merz, the range restrictions are off, and the Pentagon hasn't contradicted that. So we assume that the Americans have agreed to it, but they're not saying so openly. It's certainly not in the White House. And I think that, that's because President Trump doesn't want to make that point out loud, because it will then create a response from Putin to whatever Trump says, and probably he doesn't want to hear the response.
And I'm sure that everyone watching this probably knows the difference and the potential ranges of these missiles that the Ukrainians have. Why don't you take us through them, Mike? Because I think it is interesting, because the Taurus, it can go much further.
Yeah, well, a fair bit further. The thing is, one is the American one is the ATACMS, it's called, which is the Army Tactical Missile System, and that's fired from the back of a vehicle, and it's a ground-launched rocket, and it's fired from a multiple launch rocket launcher, so it can be used with systems that are already there for different purposes. It's a certain type of missile, and that will go 250, 300 kilometers. So it's in the battlefield terms, that's a long way, 150 odd miles. That's a deep strike weapon. But Storm Shadow will go between 350 and 500 kilometers,
right, and
Taurus will go 550 kilometers. But the big thing about Storm Shadow and Taurus, they're very similar missiles in many respects, in the weight and so on. But the big difference with those two is that they're air launched, so they'll go as far as the aircraft will take them. So an aircraft might go 500 kilometers or 1,000 kilometers and then release it. So then it's a range of 1,500 kilometres. And so the Ukrainians can choose, I mean, generally speaking, when they've released Storm Shadow missiles, they're from aircraft inside Ukrainian airspace.
And which aircraft are they releasing them from?
They can launch them from F-16s, and they've created the Su-24s that they had. They were able to adjust them. Yeah, they're quite heavy, but they were able to adjust them to carry two, one under each wing, more or less. And so the Su-24s can launch them. But generally speaking, those are old Soviet-era aircraft, but they're good enough. You want the aircraft to be as just a ferry, really, for the missile. They've launched them, we believe, from inside Ukrainian airspace. But if they, had the gall or the courage or the recklessness to fly over Russian airspace for a while, the further into Russia they get, the greater the range of the missile when they release it. The other thing about Storm Shadow and Taurus is probably better than Storm Shadow for this, so they're both good, is that they're stealthy. They hug the ground. And they're usually used in conjunction with what's called a MALD missile. And a MALD missile is a small American missile which flies above them. And the MALD missile can make itself look like a flight of missiles, an aircraft, a flight of aircraft.
It's a decoy.
Yeah, it can actually make itself look like different things on radar. And the idea is a MALD missile flies above it, and the real missile flies below it through the gaps that the MALD missile creates. And then when it gets near the target, then it rises to an operational height, and then it drops. And then the thing about the Taurus, which is better than the others, is the warhead. It's got this thing called the Mephisto warhead, and it's a very intelligent warhead, so it can bury deep into a concrete structure or the side of a hill or whatever the target is. It can go deep inside before it explodes. Now, Storm Shadow does the same, but Storm Shadow does it on the basis of a timed missile. So there's one explosion at the surface and then another explosion when the warhead's further in, milliseconds apart. What the Mephisto is able to do is there's a first explosion that gets it into the structure, but the second explosion only occurs when the warhead feels that the pressure is right. And so it's very intelligent against certain sorts of targets. And if you saw a Mephisto go off against, let's say, an underground bunker, if you could watch it in slow motion, what you'd probably see is, in very slow motion, you'd see the missile hit and go in. And then instead of a huge mushroom explosion, you'd probably see a jet of flame come out the hole. Wow. Because the real explosion is 30 feet down or whatever it might be. And so the Taurus is a very good missile. It's designed specifically for attacking bridges, fixed structures, dumps, underground concrete structures, and so on. And that's where the Ukrainians would get the use of it if they get it, and if they get enough of them to make a difference.
If they get it. I hope that answers your question, Cameron. You asked what impact they might have on the war and how they're different to what Ukraine currently has. Michael, talk to us a little bit about how they could use this missile to push the Russians back as well. You were talking just about the use against their aircraft and where they launch the glide bombs as well.
The thing about the glide bombs, the Russians developed very cleverly a system whereby their old dumb bombs that they've had for years, which were got to be dropped by aircraft flying over the target, but they found if they could fit wings to them and a very crude GPS guidance system or GLONASS guidance, GLONASS is their GPS, if they can drop these bombs, release them from 25, 30,000 feet, then the bomb will glide for 30 or even 40 miles before it lands. So they're able to drop these bombs more or less from inside Russia, and they'd glide over the border to the frontline trenches. And, a bomb that's gliding down is still going very, very fast, and it's pretty small. It's almost impossible to defend against. And those glide bombs have been doing real harm against frontline Ukrainian areas, but also against some of the cities and the civilian targets. The Russians have used thousands and thousands of glide bombs. Now, the only way you can do something about the glide bombs is you've got to attack the air bases from which the aircraft take off to drop them. And you can't really close an airbase just by attacking it. You can interrupt its operations. You can make it unsafe. And if the Ukrainians are able to use these long-range weapons, not just Taurus, but also Storm Shadow and maybe Atacms, if they can use them against the air bases where these Russian aircraft are taking off, it will force the Russians to pull their aircraft back, take them further away, out of harm's way, and that would reduce the performance of the glide bombs and maybe the frequency of attacks. But even that's not a complete answer. There's no complete answer to glide bombs, but the best answer is to attack the air bases where they start from.
the strategy
maybe do that.
to go after the airframes and guess destroy the airfield
If
as much
they,
as
if
possible.
they can get the airframes, that's even better. But and it's tough because the Russians used to be foolish enough to line up all their aircraft on the bases inside Russia on the assumption that they were absolutely safe and they were lined up like wingtip to wingtip, which is a great way to
lose them all if you get hit.
Well, they don't do that now.
Right.
I mean, they have learned from some expensive failures to disperse their aircraft even deep in Russia because the Ukrainians, with their drones mainly, have been attacking much deeper into Russia.
So that's a difference they could make. Thank you for that, Cameron. Thanks for the question. Thanks for the answer, Michael. Johnny has a question as well, and you touched on it a little bit there in your first answer about the Kersh Bridge and the use of Taurus potentially against a target like that.
There have been 2 attacks on the Kersh Bridge. One that was possibly a truck bomb, which did a tremendous amount of damage. Was very lucky for the Ukrainians to do that much damage. If it only was a truck bomb, I still have my doubts about that, having looked at the footage.
What do you think it was then? If it wasn't a
Not
truck
sure.
bomb?
I mean, I suspect it was from underneath because the idea of a truck bomb going off on the top of the bridge, an explosion going upwards and sideways, doing so much damage underneath the bridge, I don't find that very convincing.
So is it a UAV type?
It might have been. I wonder if it was a missile at the time, but that happened to coincide with a truck that looked as if it blew up at the same time. I don't know. That's a bit of a mystery. But then there was a second attack that was from UAVs, from baby drones. They got some robotic ships underneath the bridge, and that did a second part of damage. So they've attacked it twice. The first time was most successful. And, of course, the bridge is now very heavily defended. But if they use Taurus, if they could get 4 or 5 Taurus missiles on the bridge and use with the Mephisto warheads, they could drop that bridge. They put a big hole in it for quite a long time. One wouldn't be enough. One would certainly damage it. But 2 or 3 reasonably close together would probably drop it, as they say in the military, drop the bridge, meaning put a big enough hole in it, big enough gap in it, you can make it really hard to repair.
And just reminds everyone watching why the Kersh Bridge is so important.
Yeah, Kersh Bridge is really important because it was the bridge built before the Kersh Strait just had a ferry, and Kersh Strait connects, or is the strait in between Russia proper, proper legal Russia, and illegal Crimea, illegal because it's been annexed by Russia. And so by building a bridge, instead of the old ferry couldn't cope with anything like the amount of traffic that needed to go on it after 2014 when the Russians took over Crimea illegally. And this bridge, very long bridge, is Putin's pride and joy, and he drove over it in a big truck to show how important it was. And the point is the bridge is an absolutely legitimate military target because it's an illegal bridge. The Russians should not be in Crimea. They should not have annexed it, and they have no right to build a bridge from their territory into a territory that's illegally annexed. So, the bridge itself is an absolutely legitimate military target. And it is, apart from the symbolic value of it, it is the bridge through which a lot of material goes backwards and forwards into Crimea, which then goes north into Zaporizhia and Kherson Oblast for the war against Ukraine. So dropping that bridge would have a strategic impact, but a big, big symbolic impact. And it would annoy the big Jesus out of Putin.
So terrible shame to do that. Reason. But seriously, when it comes to annoying someone like that, has he set it up as one of his red lines? Is the nuclear saber sort of waved, that sort of thing, if you attack the Kersh Bridge?
Well, everything for him is a red line. I mean, right. He waves his nuclear saber at everything. So, we shouldn't be surprised at that. But undoubtedly, it would shock, it did shock Russian public opinion when the first attack occurred. Mm-hmm. And what the Russians say, it's terrorism. We're fighting terrorists here, and that's their line. But as I say, any defence analyst around the world will tell you that's a legitimate military target, which is of strategic value as well as political value. Will the Ukrainians do it? I don't know. How many Taurus missiles can they afford to try? They'd need to try quite a lot to get 4 or 5 onto the bridge.
And I suppose they'd have, S-400, S-300 set up either side to try and
they've got
the Russian air defence.
The air defence around the bridge now is very high. So it would take a big effort from lots of things, not just the Taurus, to open up a gap to get enough Taurus missiles through. And some of them almost certainly would fail. So, it's a cost-benefit effective calculation. How much have you got to put in to make the attack on the bridge? But whenever we've talked about Taurus for the last 2 years, when Scholz said, we will not allow Taurus to be used. The two things that were always in his mind, which he said a couple of times, he said it could be used to attack the bridge. Yes, that's the whole idea. And they might reach Moscow. Yes, that's true as well. But the Ukrainians, if they do that, then they'll be risking our support if they use Taurus to attack Moscow, unless it was a very, very clear military site and they hit it accurately and didn't cause civilian casualties.
That's that calculation that they've got to make, isn't it? And this is always the argument that they were fighting with one hand tied behind their back through all of this. All right, let's move on to some more questions, Michael. Got a question here from Fenton, and it's about the Americans and their supply of equipment. Fenton asks, is America still supplying Ukraine with new military equipment? What is the current state of Ukraine's weapons stockpile?
Yeah, they've still got, we don't know in detail because that's clearly a military secret. But the word is that they've still got the remains of the $62 billion dollar package, which was agreed in March last year, because that was phased over about a year, and they've still got that, and that will run through the summer. But they're getting towards the end of it. They've still got the systems, most of them, but their ammunition stocks are low. Right. Now, about 6 weeks ago, President Trump approved a $50 million package.
Billion.
No, 50 million, which is trivial in comparison to these things, 50 million. But the principle that he had, it was the first aid package he had approved as president. So the fact that he had approved an aid package was symbolically important and may be the beginning of a bigger commitment. 50 million is, in a sense, neither here nor there. So it was probably for ammunition. Right. If it was for systems, it would have been more than 50 million. So the fact that it was 50 million more was probably more ammunition. Maybe it was more missiles, more Patriot battery missiles, something like that. They never said what it was. So there's been a little improvement in that respect. But the bottom line is that the Ukrainians will run out of their American systems by the end of the summer. And they're getting European systems, which replace some but not all. And the thing that they haven't run out of yet, and this is the delicate one, is intelligence help from the United States. Right. The Americans are still giving them targeting help, intelligence information, and Starlink, which we've talked about before, the Starlink satellite system, which could be turned off, in an instant if necessary, or if Elon Musk wanted to, or the Americans wanted to. So, as important as weapons, as sort of pointy end heavy metal, are the intelligence and satellite links which the Americans are providing. If they go on providing that, then the Europeans could keep Ukraine going in other sorts of weapons just about for the rest of this year and maybe into next year. But without that intelligence help or Starlink, the Ukrainians will find it really very difficult.
Yeah, and I suppose that threat is ever present, that they could turn it off if they wanted to. The State Department website says that the US has provided $66.5 billion in military assistance since the full-scale invasion. And the thing during the Biden administration was there was always this promise that the next aid package was due. We're not seeing any promise of another large aid package at the moment, are we?
No, and the Biden administration said, remember all the trouble they had getting that aid package through the $62 billion as it was.
Trump that nixed it then, that's right. Time, wasn't it?
It should have been in November of, what are we on now, 25? It should have been November 23, and then it drifted into January 24, and it was March 24, last March, before they finally got it through. And they only got it through because Trump, sitting in Mar-a-Lago, before he was even adopted as the Republican candidate, was able to say, I agree or I don't agree. And Republicans in Congress did what he told them.
Incredible.
Astonishing.
Yeah.
A man who wasn't even a candidate had the ability to hold up a major international piece of diplomacy, an aid package. Anyway, they got it through, but the Biden administration made pretty clear. They said, "Look, I don't think there'll be any more after this. We've probably come to the end of the line in terms of the American public's tolerance for this.
Right.
The idea that we're giving so much aid, even though, as we've said before, the total amount of aid which the United States was giving to Ukraine was less than 5% of their defense budget, which was effectively taking Russia off the board strategically. And for a country that wanted to concentrate on China, that's a pretty cheap way of taking a major competitor out of the competition while you concentrate on the thing that worries you most. And of that money, all that aid money, again, as we've said before, almost 90% of it was spent in the United States.
Right. On American
weapons,
systems.
On weapons, yeah.
So
the weapons are US weapons.
Yeah.
So it was like a huge subsidy to US defense contractors, and they were involved in more than 30 states. Last time I looked, there were 114 different production lines being kept going by aid to Ukraine. And so, although it was aid to Ukraine, these weapons were due to go to Ukraine one way or another. The fact is, the money was being spent in America.
So it completely highlights the fact that this idea that, as Trump said, that they'd given stuff away and they weren't going to get anything back for it, which just wasn't true. And Michael, while there's no aid package coming, it is being reported, isn't it, that the Trump administration may be willing to allow Ukrainians with European money to buy the systems.
Yeah.
There's nothing given, but they can just spend the tens of billions that they need to buy the kit in.
If the Ukrainians had the cash, the Americans are saying, okay, well, if you've got the cash, then we'll sell our weapons to Europe. If Europe wants to transfer them, we won't prevent that. I mean, they usually they can. You can normally, with aid transfers, it's called end user privilege. So you say this weapon can only be used by the people we sell it to. You can't sell it on, or you can agree to allow it to be sold on, and you can agree to allow equipment that's got your components to be sold on, or you can stop it. And that's why Germany was stopping some weapon systems with German components being sold. So the complex series of contractual issues. But the Americans are seeming to indicate that if the Ukrainians have got the money to buy weapons from Europe, the Americans don't mind if they are American weapons which are procured by Europe and given to Ukraine.
I mean, for the point you make that it's good for the American industrial complex.
Totally.
It will continue to help them. All right, let's move on to another question here from Jim. And it's one that I've pushed you on a few times about Trump and his sort of dealings in this since he came to power. Are we any closer to ending this war than before Trump came to power, Jim asks. We're certainly talking about ceasefire. We weren't talking about ceasefire before Trump came into power, Michael, were we?
No, not effectively. Only because Trump said, I will create a ceasefire, I'll end the war in 24 hours and all that. We're no closer now because, the fundamental fact is that you only get to a ceasefire in any war when both sides think that they've got more to gain from a ceasefire than carrying on fighting. As long as one side or both are willing and able to carry on fighting, then they will do if they think that they'll gain more from that. Ceasefires are when one or both sides see that they will have got more to gain from peace. Or one side can't carry on and the other side thinks, okay, well, this is our time now to cash in our gains. We won't go for any more. It's a balance of where you think your advantage lies. Now, the Ukrainians have arrived at the point where they would love a ceasefire because they need a break, even though they don't expect this war to be over anytime soon. The war to preserve their integrity from Russian takeover will go on for a couple of generations or more. They know that. But a ceasefire would be welcome. But for the Russians, a ceasefire for them would be giving up an advantageous position because they believe that they have shown that they can win this war, that they can take more territory, even though the cost is getting higher all the time. Cost is rising all the time, not falling. But the Kremlin believes, and Putin seems to believe, that they've got more to gain from fighting than from talking.
Well, they're turning into a fully militarized society, aren't they? This is the whole point, that they've turned their economy fully towards the support of this war. The propaganda, the ideology within Russia is that the West and NATO is out to get us and Ukraine is just the first step. So at this point, that it would seem irrational, use that word, for them to stop fighting because it would go against this thing that they've been telling their country for the last 3 years.
And I've been talking, actually, just this week to some of the senior diplomats and ex-intelligence chiefs and so on, and they all believe that Putin's almost like riding a tiger in that he can't get off now because he is judged by his success in this war. He's given so much to it. He's turned Russia into such a war economy that it's a one-issue country now. They've got to somehow prevail in this war against Ukraine. And if the people around him, the oligarchs, who they can't get off the tiger either, but they don't seem to be particularly happy about it because, he's not providing them with what they thought they were going to get, and he's not delivering for them in the way that he was 10 years ago. But if he is perceived now somehow to give up or to be pushed back, then he probably won't last. And the perception is, and that's what Western analysts say, that he's got no choice but to carry on because he has to achieve some sort of acknowledged success, which is more than he's got at the moment. He's got to get more than he presently possesses in Ukraine to make it worth the sacrifices that Russia has already made. So that he's only got one direction. He's only got one gear, one direction he can go in, and he'll keep going until he's prevented by physical force, by the physical inability to go any further. Diplomacy won't stop him.
No.
Only physical force of some sort will stop him. Some sort of brick wall where you cannot go any further, Mr. Putin, and he stops there, and then his own society makes a judgment on whether that was successful enough for what it's cost them.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to a couple of questions and a link to that. So first of all, on the number of war dead that's on both sides, and certainly on the Russian side, this question from Wyatt, thank you for this. How many people have died in this war? And Wyatt also asks, who's doing the counting of the dead?
Good question. Well, the deaths are, well, the casualties, Russian casualties are now just on 1 million. And that looks like something like 600,000 dead and 400,000 severely injured. It might be 5 and 5. Usually, the severely injured is rather greater than the number of dead in wars. In the case of Russia, it isn't regarded that way because so many people who would have survived are left to die because the casualty evacuation is hopeless, and so
they don't go and
injured men are just left on the battlefield and so on. So their proportion of dead to severely wounded is actually rather low in the sense that you expect severely wounded to be a much higher proportion of the dead. But anyway, the Russian casualties are widely believed, including by our own MOD and our intelligence services now, to hit the 1 million mark. Ukraine's very wary about this, but it looks as if Ukrainian casualties may be about 600,000.
Wow.
In the same proportion, in the same dead and severely wounded. But their dead is probably 250,000 and maybe 450,000, something like that, 400,000 severely wounded, but still very high. Civilians, the more precise figures on that, the United Nations collects the verifiable figures, which are actual people with names and identities that they can verify. And the present number is 13,000 dead Ukrainian civilians and just under 32,000 severely injured.
Right.
So 45,000 civilians. And that's the Office for the Observation of Human Rights. So the real figure is probably higher, but not so much higher because those are all verified. And on Ukraine's side, we actually, we know what those figures are because the Ukrainians, have an interest in broadcasting and telling us. And who counts? Well, different people count. There are private organisations like the Institute for the Study of War are very good. UN figures, they're authoritative. You can look at figures produced by the intelligence agencies, which are in the public domain in the West. One good way, though, if you worry about this, about the sources, and it's a fair question, go onto Wikipedia. I'm a great fan of Wikipedia for all sorts of
as I said to you before, I never thought a professor would tell me to use Wikipedia. Because I remember being told by a professor a long time ago never to use it.
I give them money every year because I use them a lot. For some people say, "Oh yeah, we can tell," but no, for certain things, Wikipedia are very good. And if you look at Ukraine war casualties, what Wikipedia will do, there's a long account. But there's a table, and they'll give you all of the casualty figures that are advertised by the Russians, by the Ukrainians, by independent sources, by the NGOs, and so on. And there's a table, and you can make your own judgments, and you can look at the figures that seem to be more generally accepted by several sources. So it's a very quick way of looking down the sources. And of course, what you see is a huge difference between the official Russian figures and the official Ukrainian figures. Yeah. Neither of them are regarded as accurate, but others, as it were, lean more towards one than the other. But you can get a good idea from that table as to what the ballpark of what the real figure probably is.
Yeah, shout out to Jimmy Wells, of course.
Yeah,
the man behind Wikipedia.
Well, he gets some of my money every year.
He does. He gets a couple of my quids as well. Michael, I don't know if we can do this, but you're the perfect person to ask. How do those casualty figures compare to wars? It's a very different war, of course, but for the amount of time and perhaps, the amount of material that's been used, how does it compare to other conflicts?
Well, okay, I'll give you one figure. The Second World War, Anthony Beevor, excellent historian, he recently wrote an article in Foreign Affairs where he said the total casualties of the Second World War, military and civilian, was 85 million. 85 million. And that lasted 6 years. Mm-hmm. It was actually a series of wars. It was, we call it the Second World War, but it's a series of wars in different parts of the world that are somehow united with the ideology behind it all. And so this war has lasted 3 and a bit years, and total casualty figures is perhaps 1.5 million now. Mm-hmm. Casualty figures in the First World War, total casualty figures, were about 20 million around the world, military and civilian. mainly military, not as many civilian casualties in the First World War. Second World War, far more civilian casualties. And funnily enough, the pandemic, the Asian flu pandemic after the First World War killed 40 million people, twice as many as the war. But nobody kind of remembers that with the same horror because the war is uniquely horrible. So if we think about 20th century world wars, we're dealing in tens of millions. In this war, we're dealing with probably 2 million, and it may go to 3 or 4 million if this war goes on for sort of 5-8 years. Other 20th century wars, the Vietnam War, American casualties, 60, 70,000. Civilian casualties, about 2 million, 2.5 million, something like that. And then apart from that, other wars, the biggest war of the 20th century was the Iraq-Iran War, lasted for 8 years, and that was 900,000 casualties. Right. That was close on 1 million. So, in terms of outside the world wars, you have to say this is bigger than all of the other ones that we talk about. Vietnam, Afghanistan, the Russians in Afghanistan, the Iraq-Iran War. It's certainly bigger than that, but it's nowhere near, of course, the First or Second World War.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to another question I've got here, Michael. My apologies for losing my way. Question here from Fairclough. There was a big prisoner of war swap past few days, and Fairclough asks, do we have any idea what condition the prisoners of war on each side are kept in? And Fairclough says that his grandfather was a POW in Austria, and he returned home after the war, but of course was very affected by it for the rest of his life, as I kind of imagine you would have to be.
Yeah. Yes, in contrast to a lot of British war films of the 1950s, those lovely black and white British war films, and some of those POW films made it all seem a bit like a sort of public school japes with foolish Germans who were easily fooled. I mean, being a prisoner of war is no joke. Is nothing at all like that. And you read the real accounts of POW camps, even the Second World War, which were fairly civilised, they're nothing like the image. But yes, the differences between the two, and there's a fair bit of evidence for this, is that the Ukrainians have been pretty badly treated in the Russian POW camps. There's a lot of executions taking place, and the UN are chasing up a lot of allegations, some of which I've seen some of the proof of, certainly seem to have happened. And, you can just see the prisoner exchange. You saw the Ukrainian prisoners coming back, and you could see they were ill. They were glad to be there, but they were thin. They weren't entirely emaciated, but they were ill. And then you looked at the Russian prisoners going back. They've been given fresh combat outfits, I assume by the Russians who picked them up before they filmed them, and they look pretty healthy. Right. And again, remember that the Red Cross has access to Russian prisoners in Ukraine, but no access to Ukrainian prisoners in Russia. So I think there's a big difference. And the evidence is a mixture of plenty of anecdotal evidence. And the Russians all claim they were mistreated, but there isn't a lot of independent evidence of that. When the Ukrainians claim they've been mistreated, there is some independent evidence, and there's a lot of anecdotal evidence stacking up. So I think there's a difference. But I think we should say that it's no joke for anyone being a prisoner of war.
Absolutely not. And that's not even to mention the women and civilians who are victims of this war if they're caught behind the other side of this as an ex.
Oh, Maripole.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of women were taken prisoner at Maripole, and they've got some horrible stories. And when the first group of women were released, I remember commenting on it in the glass box over 2 years ago now. And they came out, but they walked out in ranks. I mean, these were not military people; these were women and civilians. But they walked out in ranks, and they walked out with their heads held high. And it was quite affecting in a way. We are the women of Maripole, and we're still here. That was terrific.
In many ways. All right, let's move on to some quick fire questions. I'm looking at the clock, Mike. I've got to be live on telly in a little while, so I'm going to crack through some of these.
I'll be brief.
Thanks for your patience. Yeah, we're going to get through some of these. All right, let's move on to this question here from Matt. Brief as you can, but it's a good question. If you were Zelensky for a day, what would you do?
I couldn't make any difference to the war in a day. So if I was Zelensky for a day, I'd spend it with my wife and family on the assumption that we may not be together for all that much longer. Since the beginning of this war, Zelensky and his whole family have been under a kind of mafiosi death threat. So if I had a day, I'd spend it with him.
That's a good answer. I think a lot of people will agree with you on that. Question here from Waldron. What's the likelihood of Belarus entering the conflict? Waldron says his question's told him for a year or two now. Is Putin teasing the idea of a joint Belarus-Russia conflict?
Well, look, Belarus is associated with the conflict because it's allowed its territory to be used, and it's sent supplies, and it's supplied some soldiers, actually, I mean volunteers, to the Russian army, although there are also Belarusians fighting for the Ukrainians, interestingly. But undoubtedly, all the sanctions against Russia, the initial range of sanctions, are also against Belarus. And, as I've always said, if Putin were to fall, then Lukashenko falls more or less the following day. Yeah. So Belarus is, intrinsically part of this, but will they send their army over the border? Probably, almost certainly not, because the Belarusian army is pretty hopeless. I mean, they've got on paper about 50,000. The general view is they've got about 15,000 who are combat available, and they're not regarded as very good. And the Russians don't regard them as very good either. Right. So I don't think the Belarusians can't make any real difference on the battlefield, except to allow their territory to be used by the Russians as a distraction. And the Ukrainians do. They keep a covering force up on the Belarusian border just in case there's some sort of surprise. But Belarus is not a military power that can make a big difference to Russia. Otherwise, they already would have.
Yeah, and of course, they've got their exercise at their Zapad, which I think
Zapad,
is going on at the moment, or will be going on soon. All right, next question here, and this is from one of our viewers on YouTube. Thank you for this. Groden Bol asks, and it's kind of about Russian allies as well. Can't Russia's southern or eastern neighbours put pressure on Russia to end the war? He asked whether Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, anyone else could pressurise Russia into ending the war.
Yeah, they did in a way, because when the war was going quite badly for Putin in the first year, 18 months, they sort of drew away from Putin. You saw when he went to those summits of the CTSO and people, those sort of summits, the Central Treaty, Central Security Treaty Organization, they didn't want to be photographed too close, standing too close to him. Some of them kept him waiting, which is what he used to do to everyone else. So in a way, they did put pressure on him. But now that it looks as if Putin is chipper and he thinks things are moving in his direction, they've sort of dropped that element on the assumption that they're going to have to live with him for longer than they might have expected. So the answer is, in a sense, no. They're uncomfortable about the war, but they don't particularly want to see Russia succeed, because they know if he succeeds in Ukraine, then North Kazakhstan is also an issue for Russian imperialism.
Interesting.
And that worries them in the medium term. And it worries Belarus as well in the medium term, that the Russians will take Belarus over before 2030 is what is often talked about in Moscow. So they're not comfortable about that. But on the other hand, they lean to the way they think the wind is blowing. And at the moment, the wind has reversed from being, Putin making a huge strategic error to Putin maybe coming out of this with some sense of success.
Yeah, I mean, they've got a hedge, haven't they, at the moment?
They've
got no idea where it's going to end up. Okay, question here from Matt about the Kursk offensive. And Matt asks, pointless? Well,
it didn't work in the way the Ukrainians wanted it to. They wanted it to pull away the really good units from the south, from around in Donetsk and Luhansk, but particularly Donetsk, into Kursk, and it didn't do that. But it did have some effect toward the end, in the sense that before the Ukrainians finally got kicked out of Kursk, which is very recent, the Russian offensive further south around Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar, Konstantinivka, has ground to a halt. It's not going anywhere, because the Russians did eventually need to bring in the paratroopers, the VDV, and the Marines, the naval infantry, into the northern area. So in a way, it did have an effect, but I remember saying and writing in the Sunday Times at the time, I mean, this is the most bold counterpunch strategy since the Incheon landings in the Korean War. It's a risk, a counterpunch in a different part of the battlefield altogether, where you've got to put in big resources, is a very risky thing. And I said then I can't think of as big a risk since the Incheon landings of MacArthur in 1950. And there he was. They took the risk, didn't entirely work, but it's given them some advantage, but not what they would have hoped.
I wonder what the reveal as well of the North Koreans being used tells us about the war and how it may well go for the next few years.
Yeah, what it tells us is that what Anne Applebaum calls autocracy Inc., the dictators and the autocrats, they're now helping each other, because the thing that unites them is a sense that they are working together to break what they see as the power of the Western nations over the international system in general, the influence of the Western nations. And of course, those Western nations, there may be not many of us left these days, I mean, 30-odd genuine free trading liberal democracies, genuine ones, but we account for 40-50% of GDP, global GDP, but that's a diminishing proportion. And the thing that unites North Korea and Venezuela and Iran rather, and Russia and China and others, and the Sahel countries, and is the sense that the moment has come to break the power of the West. And that's where we are with world politics.
All right, we're going to go on to the last question because, as I said, you have to get on to television. This one's from Jason John, and it's about cyber attacks and hybrid warfare. In terms of those things by Russia, China and Iran, does the UK ever retaliate when attacked, and do we engage in cyber warfare? You're giving me that look, Michael.
Yeah, well, yes, cyber war is a bit like nuclear war itself because there's no defense against it. All right? You can't defend yourself against a determined nuclear attack with missiles. And just so, you can only defend part of your system against determined cyber attack, massive cyber attack. So if you can't defend against it, it's the same logic. You deter it by saying, we have got what you have got. If you do it to us, we'll do it to you.
Do it back to you.
And it was always whispered that Britain was pretty good at this in the early 2000s. And in about, I think it was 2010, the Strategic Defence Review that year, if it wasn't 2010, it was the 2015 one, I'd have to check. We then admitted officially that we have a counter strategy, that we have offensive cyber capabilities. So we started to say out loud that we've got offensive cyber capabilities so that the groups out there know that we can mess them up in a pretty big way. Have we ever used it? I genuinely don't know. And if I did know, I wouldn't say. But I honestly don't know. Because if we have used it, we will have kept quiet about it, except to the victims who will want them to know that it was us.
Right.
And if we've used it against the Chinese, we've used it against the Russians, we'll want them to know it was us. And one final point on that is that I remember a previous defence chief saying that we used to be able to walk all the way through Chinese systems. 20 years ago, we used to walk through them. We knew everything about them. Just take a walk through their system. But they're so much better now that they're in a position, they're doing that to us. And so all we can do is threaten them with counter cyber warfare. But can we do it? Yes, we can. Are we good at it? We believe we are. Do we use it? Don't know. Have we used it? Don't know.
And you won't tell us anyway. All right, Professor Clarke, really appreciate it as always. And thank you all for watching and submitting your questions. We got through as many as we could in the time. And of course, we are going to do another one of these next week.
Yes.
I won't promise a day because I keep getting it wrong because our schedules change, but we will do it again next week. So submit your questions when you can. And Professor Clarke will actually be on air with me on Sky News later on this afternoon when we'll be talking more about the war in Ukraine.
We will.
Yes. All right. Thanks for being with us. See you again soon.